In this lesson on information processing, we will consider how information is received by humans, how it is considered, and how a response may follow. We receive information through our senses: sight, hearing, touch, smell, and taste. When flying an aircraft, the pilot must observe, interpret, and then react to information received from the senses, both in the cockpit and in the environment outside the aircraft. Information processing can be represented as a model or flowchart. This captures the main elements of the process, from receipt of information to making a decision. The process starts with the stimuli of sounds, smells, sights, sensations, and tastes. These are received by the receptors and sensory stores. As long as the stimulus is large enough to get over the sensory threshold, for example, a noise is loud enough to be heard and infrequent enough not to become accepted, known as habituation, then it will register in the attention mechanism. This information is interpreted into a meaningful message with the help of our stored experience and knowledge, which we can call our perception of stimuli. In reaching an interpretation of these stimuli, our central decision maker relies upon our short-term and long-term memories. The central decision maker then decides upon a course of action. It may be an unconscious action, called a motor action, such as changing gear in a car, or a conscious action, such as selecting an engine close-down program. The effect of this action will then feed back as a stimulus, and the process continues until the required response to the original stimulus has been made. By using this model, it is possible to identify where any error has occurred. For example, the long-term memory may have suggested the incorrect Mayday radio frequency. Let us look in a little more detail at the elements of the model. The analysis of the inputs, which come from the outside world, are described as bottom-up or data-driven. The analysis of inputs, which come from prior knowledge and are stored in the long-term memory, are known as top-down or conceptually driven. An example of this would be that you observe a black shape in a park. The analysis of inputs from the outside world and from prior knowledge enable you to interpret the black shape as a Labrador. Where both types of analysis are present, which is the norm, it is called interactive processing. Stimuli, such as a bell ringing, are stored for a brief time after the input is finished, in what are called sensory memories. The ability to retain these stimuli for an ultra-short time is essential, as when they first arrive, one may not have the processing capacity to deal with them. The sensory memory for sound, or echoic memory, lasts for between 2 and 8 seconds, and enables one, for example, to recall the chimes of a clock even though one did not immediately concentrate on them. The sensory memory for sight, or iconic memory, only lasts between a half to 1 second, but 80% of information processed comes from the things we see and is therefore very important. On the screen, 8 keyboard letters were shown. Did you read the words black dog? Sensory receptors adapt fairly rapidly to stimuli. When first sensed, the receptors respond at a very high impulse rate, but gradually this will reduce and may ultimately produce no response at all. That is why we do not feel our clothes against our skin, nor do we notice the traffic after a while. This lack of response to continuing stimuli is called habituation. If the stimulus registers with the senses, it moves to the next phase and gets into our attention mechanism. However, there is no guarantee that we will pay attention to the correct or important stimulus. For example, two pilots may continue chatting, even though their peripheral vision may have observed a warning light flashing. Attention can be defined as the concentration of mental effort on sensory or mental events to enhance perception and performance. Distinguish this from vigilance, which is the degree of activation of the central nervous system. Due to the limitations of the central processor, we are generally unable to pay attention to a number of different items at the same time. Although attention can move quickly from one item to another, it can only deal with one item at a time, which means that a pilot must prioritize. This is known as single-channel processing. Attention can take several forms. Selective attention occurs when one is monitoring several sources of input, with greater attention being given to one or more sources which appear more important. A person can be consciously attending to one source whilst still sampling another in the background. This is known as the cocktail party effect, whereby one can be engrossed in a conversation, but one's attention is diverted as one hears one's name mentioned on the other side of the room. Distraction is the negative side of selective attention, such as when a pilot is receiving too much information. Divided attention occurs because our central decision-making channel can timeshare between a number of tasks. The pilot flying a visual approach will be dividing his attention between looking to maintain his approach and checking instruments. Whereas it would appear that he is working on a number of tasks at the same time, in reality, the central processor is spending a fraction of every second on a number of different tasks in turn. The mind always pays attention to something, but the danger for pilots is that attention management is poor, and that attention is paid to the incorrect stimulus. The amount and quality of attention paid to any task will be reflected in the performance of the task. Similarly, the extent to which we are ready to respond to a task, which is called arousal, also has a direct bearing upon performance. This relationship can be represented by an inverted U-curve on a graph. At times of low arousal, such as in the cruise, a pilot's attention may wander. Generating artificial workloads, such as a 5-minute position check, or making timed radio calls, may help to focus attention. At optimal arousal, such as on an approach which is going well, the central processor is at its most efficient and performance is at its best. At times of high arousal, there is a real danger of the central processor becoming overloaded. There may be too much information, called quantitative overload. Or the information may be too difficult to understand, which is called qualitative overload. A few of the symptoms of overload are a sharp degradation of performance, blinkered attention, and mood swings. Stress will obviously make things worse, and we will look at this in greater detail in the lesson on stress. After the information has been gathered and noted, it has to be interpreted or converted into a meaningful structure, that is, our perception of the information. This perception may or may not be correct. Take a look at this triangle and read what it says. Most people will read the first 3 lines, and because it's a well-known phrase, they believe that they know what's coming next. But look closely, and you will see that there is an extra the. One could say that our perception is what we make of what we sense. Two people seeing the same scene will, more than likely, describe it differently. For example, Look at this scene and make a note of the order in which you perceive things. Did you first see a tree or people? What makes us see things differently are our mental models that we each have, based upon our past experiences and learning. One person may assess whether the tree is safe because of a past mishap. Another may assess the color of the leaves because of his interest in foliage. Perception is always subjective. The advantage of having mental models is that the brain can speed up the perception process. However, the disadvantage of the mental model is that stimuli may not be given adequate attention, with the result that we make the facts fit our mental model. A pilot may be expecting engine 1 to give trouble, and when an alarm is sounded, he may jump to the incorrect conclusion that it is indeed engine 1 that has the problem. It is in fact engine 2 that has the problem. For example, when unsure of one's aircraft's position, one may try to fit the map to what one sees on the ground and say, "That's Oxford, isn't it?" because we are hoping to see Oxford. Seeking information which confirms our model and ignoring other evidence is known as confirmation bias. Our perception of a situation is also influenced by our mental schemas, that is, our mental representations of categories of objects, events, and people. For example, most people have a mental schema of a football match, which is a collection of images. It might include the ground, the players, the noise, crowds, and even hot dogs. Such mental schema may be unhelpful, as an actual situation may be colored by the content of the mental schema. For example, the question, "Was there a hot dog stall there?" may be answered by, "Well, there usually is. I expect there was one there." Our perception of the world is greatly influenced by our vision, and the lesson on cognition looks at this in detail. However, it is worth recalling here that near objects occlude or obscure distant objects, whilst objects at a distance lose their clarity, making it difficult to judge form and size, and their angle, subtended at the retina, becomes smaller with increased distance. Retinal size is of particular importance to the pilot. For example, in the final stages of an approach, the pilot is likely to judge his height above the ground from the retinal size of the runway. To make this judgment, however, he must have a stored expectation of the likely size and slope of the runway. For example, if the runway slopes up more than he expects, it will appear larger than he expects, and it will give the impression that he is too high and going to overshoot. He may then fly lower, in order to comply with the expected visual model of being 3 degrees above an assumed flat runway, but his flight path will end short of the runway. We can see from the information processing model that the central decision maker is served by the short-term and long-term memories. It is the attention mechanism which selects what information is passed to the short-term memory. Information can be stored here for up to 20 seconds, but it will then be lost. This may be long enough for its use. For example, approach air traffic control may tell the pilot to change frequency to ground air traffic control.
Ground is on 121.9er.
Lufthansa 411, the old copy, 0.9er. Long.
The pilot will remember the new frequency long enough to use it, but he will then forget it. Acoustic information is considered easier to retain than visual information, as it is easier to rehearse in full. For example, telephone inquiries may give you a number, and you will no doubt repeat this number to yourself until you have finished using it, and then it will be binned. The short-term memory is also limited in the amount it can contain. It is considered that an average person can retain 7 plus or minus 2 unrelated items. Read this list once and see how much of it you can repeat in the correct order. It's not easy. But it is easy to improve the number of remembered items, for example by association. Make a story out of the words. Alternatively, create a mnemonic out of the first letters of the words, even adding letters, such as vowels, to make sense out of the letters. In the case of numbers, divide them into chunks of 2 or 3, as is done by the French telephone network. Try these two lines of numbers and see which is easier to remember. The short-term memory can easily be displaced by an interruption or a new stimulus. For example, if you have been given a telephone number, which you are trying to remember, and then you are given another number, it is highly likely that the first number will be displaced by the second, or that neither number is remembered. The long-term memory receives information from the short-term memory which has been rehearsed, and it will be stored indefinitely. For example, the alphabet learned in primary school will be remembered forever once it has been rehearsed and hence learned properly. There are 3 categories of long-term memory: semantic, episodic, and procedural. The first 2 are known as declarative memory. The semantic memory stores general knowledge of the world, storing information which enables us to answer such questions as, "Do all birds fly?" It is believed that the semantic memory holds concepts that are represented in a dense network of associations. It is generally thought that once information has entered the semantic memory, it is seldom lost. When we are unable to remember a word, it is because we are unable to find where the word in the semantic memory is stored, not because it has been lost from the store. Episodic memory stores events or episodes in one's life. For example, seeing a wedding. Episodic memory is not as accurate as semantic memory. Episodic, more than semantic memory, is subject to influence and deterioration. It is heavily influenced by one's assumption about what happened. For example, one might remember a young person lying on a pavement. But this image may be incorrectly interpreted as a person who was drunk, whereas the person may have had a fit or had been assaulted. One might add on non-existent images, such as beer cans, and other people, because one has seen a beer bottle in previous similar situations. Time will also reduce the clarity and accuracy of episodic memory. Similarly, variations may appear on repeating the story, but the teller believes the revised version to be accurate. Recollection of events can also be influenced by suggestion. For example, when asked to estimate a car's speed, the answer may be higher if the questioner asks, "What speed was the car doing when it screeched round the corner?" Amnesia affects episodic memory more than semantic memory. After a head injury, a person may be unable to remember an event, such as a wedding, episodic memory, but will still be able to take the lift to the 8th floor, semantic memory. There are 2 forms of amnesia. One is called anterograde amnesia, in which new events in the short-term memory are not transferred to the permanent, long-term memory. The sufferer will not be able to remember anything for more than a brief period after it occurs. The other type is called retrograde amnesia. which is an inability beyond ordinary forgetfulness to recall some memory of the past. There are several causes of amnesia, such as a head injury, a stroke, a viral brain infection, a tumor, or a severe emotional shock, known as dissociative amnesia. Not being able to remember last night's heavy drinking is not a symptom of amnesia. Alcohol abuse can result in events not being transferred from short-term memory to long-term memory. Long-term alcohol abuse, resulting in a vitamin B1 deficiency, can cause permanent damage to the memory function. Let us go back to the model. The long and short-term memory inputs and stimuli have been interpreted into a perception of the situation, and so a decision is made as to what action to take. For example, on seeing a temperature gauge go into the red, a pilot may throttle back the power. This action will have consequences which must be reviewed. The action will produce another stimulus, such as a temperature gauge going down if the action was successful. However, if the pilot throttles back the wrong engine, the high temperature will remain and the pilot will have to review his actions and the problem. As we saw earlier, semantic and episodic memories are known as declarative memories. The third type of long-term memory is procedural memory, sometimes called non-declarative memory. A characteristic of procedural memory is that it involves a skill, something that is difficult to explain in words. An example of this is riding a bicycle or flying an aeroplane. Skills such as juggling, which may have required active concentration during the learning stage, can be executed independently of the decision-making process. These are called motor programs or motor skills. You will see from the model that there is a direct link from the attention mechanism to motor programs and onto actions without reference to the central decision maker. To develop a motor program, there are three distinct phases. The cognitive phase comes first, in which the learner thinks consciously about each individual action, such as learning to serve in tennis. Then comes the associative phase, in which the separate components of the overall action become integrated. Finally, the automatic phase, when the total maneuver can be executed smoothly without conscious mental effort. It is the ability to fly using these motor skills that enables the pilot to send and receive RT messages without losing control of the aircraft. The motor program flies the aircraft, and the central decision maker deals with the communication. However, when the process of flying becomes non-routine, as in an emergency, the pilot may need to go back temporarily to the associative phase, thereby using conscious learning and decision-making. One can use the analogy of changing from autopilot to manual flying. These three phases, the cognitive phase, the associative phase, and the automatic phase, are also called declarative knowledge, knowledge compilation, and procedural knowledge. Students must be familiar with both sets of terms. We will look in another lesson at the topic of errors, but for now we should note that there are two types of error associated with motor programs, sometimes collectively called routine errors. These are action slips and habituation. Action slips usually occur at the selection stage. For example, the throttle, the black levers, may be closed when what was needed was to lean the fuel supply, the red levers. Habituation, or environmental capture, occurs when an action is frequently made in the same environment. In response to the captain calling for gear down, the co-pilot may say 3 greens without actually lowering the gear. The only way to avoid these errors is for pilots to constantly monitor their own and their colleagues' actions and carry out checklists properly. The information processing procedure will be influenced by many factors, such as a trade-off between speed and accuracy. For example, a delay in making a decision after an engine failure on takeoff could be critical, and there will be pressure to take action, even before all available information has been processed. High levels of arousal will lead to faster but less accurate responses. An increase in age tends to lead to responses that are slower but more accurate. Auditory warnings are more likely to attract attention because they will always be heard, compared to visual stimuli, which may be in peripheral view only. However, auditory warnings are more likely to produce an incorrect response. Prepared responses to emergency situations are an integral part of flight safety training. But if the stimulus is unexpected, the pilot may choose the prepared response instead of a more calculated response. This is called an error of commission. For example, a pilot may have noticed engine instrumentation irregularities, and he has mentally prepared himself to close down a particular engine. An unrelated noise, such as a dropped food tray, may be sufficient to cause the pilot to shut down the engine. The time interval between the onset of a given signal and the production of a response to that signal is called the response time. In the simplest case, such as pushing a button when a light illuminates, the reaction time is about 0.2 of a second. In an actual incident at Manchester, an engine was shut down in less than a second following a bang heard before V1, which is the decision speed to take off. In this case, the correct decision was made. In another case, an emergency occurred after V1, and as training has instinctively drilled the pilot to continue the takeoff and get the aircraft airborne, the pilot should have done so. But in this case, the pilot thought about the problem, identified it as the elevator, which would have made it actually impossible for the aircraft to fly, and as a result the pilot elected to stop the aircraft. The delay in the response in this case actually was the correct response and prevented multiple fatalities. Response times are relevant, but of paramount importance is making the correct response rather than a fast response. Take your time and do the task correctly, rather than have to start the task again or even make an incorrect response. We have seen that we can acquire skills or motor programs by learning and repetition, and we need to look briefly at the different types of learning. Classic or operant conditioning refers to the behaviorist approach of Pavlov, where the recipient is taught through physiological responses. Pavlov noticed that dogs in a laboratory salivated when they saw a white lab coat being worn, as they associated this with mealtime. An experienced pilot will similarly have an almost automatic response to a stall warning sound, but rather than salivating, the pilot will carry out the standard stall recovery. Insight refers to data that is intellectually or cognitively understood and retained. For example, the way that a pilot sets up the onboard navigation equipment. Observational learning or imitation is very common and would include a student pilot following through as the instructor takes off and then taking off on his own afterwards. Experience refers to learning by our own mistakes. Even though older people may have slower response times, it has been found that their overall performance deteriorates little because of their experience. The quality of any type of learning depends on various factors, such as the intellectual capacity of the recipient, the quality of the communication between the transmitter and the recipient, and the applicability of the data. The place where the information was learned is also relevant. It has been shown that it is easier to recall information when one is in an environment similar to that where the information was learned. Indeed, one research study shows that divers, who were asked to learn words underwater, recalled them better when underwater than on land. Consequently, procedures learned in a simulator will be recalled far better in a cockpit than if they were learned in a classroom. The motivation of the transmitter and the recipient is also relevant, as is overlearning. If one learns a subject in greater detail than is required, not only is recall improved, but the task itself is likely to be more resistant to stress. This concludes our lesson on information processing.